Welcome to the Digital Government Podcast. Tune in to discover the future of governance and ways of getting there.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Digital Government Podcast with yours truly, your usual host, Federico Plantera, journalist, sociologist, and researcher, today accompanied by another one of yours truly, I may say, Paul Timmers. Paul, as many of you already know, is a research associate at the University of Oxford, professor at KU Leuven, and chair of the supervisory board at the e-Governance Academy. Paul, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Federico.
We're going to reflect upon some things that we heard during the days of the e-Governance Conference 2024 that was held in Tartu, but also furthermore, just expand on something that you told me you actually got into lately more, let's say, which is exactly the interaction between technology and technological advancements and developments. So basically what we've been reading also on mainstream news and not just like specialist news in the last months, but matching that with geopolitics, because something is happening in terms of blocks of countries, regions of the world that are taking different approaches, let's say, towards implementing technology. This is something that we already knew. But now there are also some dynamics happening a bit more and that put these blocks in an interaction with each other. Yeah. But starting from the e-governance conference, I will ask a question that is a bit meta, let's say, from a host to another host, because at the e-governance conference you were moderating a panel, which was the opening panel of the conference, that was titled "Learning from the Past, Growing Today, and Winning Tomorrow." Let's put this title in the context. Unlocking Digital Success was the focus point and also the title of the conference overall. And you were on stage with policymakers and change makers from different areas of the world. If I'm not wrong, you had guests from Africa, but also Latin America and also Estonia. And Europe, obviously. Yes, with Estonia. So my question to you is, of those lessons learned that were shared on stage, no? If you remember, what struck with you particularly? What was said that you thought, this is a real learning that does unlock digital success?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Federico. So it was a very interesting panel because of this diversity of backgrounds of the people that were involved, and also because they had been put in the mindset, can you look back a number of years that you have been involved in this field, and for some of them it's as long as 20 years, and then see where are we coming from, where are we today, and in the fork in the road that we probably have to choose, which direction do we go for the future. Take a topic like AI or geopolitics, there are all these kind of choices that come up, involvement of the citizens. So some of the things that I found striking in their answers is, first of all, I thought, how rich is it actually of the elements that they bring onto the table? Some people were talking about the basis, the infrastructure. Others were talking about a relationship between government and citizens. So that's really what ultimately touches upon who takes decisions. What is democracy, for example? Others again were talking really in terms of how the development had progressed slowly, perhaps, then suddenly accelerated because of fortunate and wise decisions that were taken, the take up of digital ID. So a very kind of rich pattern, you might say, of answers. And I thought for myself, but this is actually how the reality is of today. It's not a simple kind of thing that we are talking about, digital transformation in government. You have to be able to look at these various aspects that come into play, from infrastructure to usage, from governments to citizens to the private sector, from the values that you have that may be quite different from people in another part of the world. And you have to be able to combine that. So challenging. At the same time, this may lead to some paralysis, if it is so complex, but it is not paralysis, because that was the other kind of thing that struck me, is that several of the panelists said, but we have real success in this. So many services online. We suddenly have not a few million, we have 50 million people that are using their digital ID really practically. We do really do these government labs where we experiment about new forms. So that I think was also quite encouraging. And a bit more than, let's say, just encouraging, it's reality. So it has now become reality for many people. So a good moment, actually, I think it was quite an interesting panel to look backwards and to then look forwards. So where could we be in 5, 10 years from now? Uncertainty also, because we are also at a moment in time, I think that everybody recognizes that big technological developments, AI to mention one, big developments in terms of this relationship between citizens and government. So, are we still ultimately really the center as humans of public services was one of the questions that we talked about. I think no one kind of fully affirmatively dares to say this is exactly how it will be. So we need to watch that. And how will we behave in this, geopoliticized world where perhaps there are bigger choices that are coming onto us than we had foreseen 20 years ago when we were living in a fairly peaceful internet environment. Now we are talking about an environment where there's also real war near to people. So life has changed, I think.
Life has changed, and you mentioned different kinds of relationships, let's say different ends of this relationship that is somehow like driven and shaped by technology. You said, for example, the citizens and the government and businesses, but on digital topics by now, it also got down to governments and governments. Because, for example, something that I remember we heard on stage, and that I think was interesting to notice that was quite a salient topic, was exactly interoperability in a cross-border manner, and how, for example, representatives from different countries at the conference on different stages, in different sessions, still meant from different areas and regions of the world, still mention the topic of we would like now to exchange like the next thing is like we would like to see how to exchange data like with other countries or like across regions within the same country and so. For example, in the case of like federal governments with federal states. Yep. In that sense, the conference being the 10th year that it takes place, it's also a very good moment to take stock of where we are at the moment, which is something that I remember Luca Silves did on stage I remember that I noted it down in my Moleskine in the notes that the quote was essentially that we are entering an entirely new era of computing at the moment, no? So a bit connected to that question, but from your own point of view, with an EU-based approach, how do you think that the European Union and Europe in general, is at the moment positioned in the face of this new era of computing that we are entering?
Yeah. If you look at a topic like interoperability, take that topic, it's already since a long time on the agenda. And one of the strengths that Lucas Silves mentioned is for sure that the EU can create legal frameworks that help, for example, for interoperability to move forward. But one strength that he did not mention is I think there is a lot of continuity. There's kind of stamina in the European Union. It may take a long time, but it goes on. Take electronic ID. We started talking about that in 2003. We got legislation. It's still on the agenda now, but in the meantime, we got it actually introduced. It's getting integrated into services. Legal and technical interoperability and application level interoperability is happening across Europe. Is it sufficient in terms of usage? No, it has to be much more. It really also has to be used. So perhaps the EU is not always the fastest, but it will continue on these kind of topics. Now let's talk about does that hold also for other areas? I think it does. So let me take a completely different example, but that's very closely related to the field of public administration security, cybersecurity.
Please.
So in cybersecurity, it's an interesting case where you say, we started to discover around in the years in the beginning of this millennium, so to say, that there were all kind of cyber incidents There were some wake-up calls. There was the cyber attack on Estonia. That was a wake-up call, but still not that much happened in terms of public policy. Then we got other incidents, some massive distortions, disruptions, cyber crime rising, Snowden affair, Chinese espionage, etc. More and more signals that said, well, we really need to do something serious about cybersecurity. But then people said, well, but that's all something we will arrange at home. You do not need to do that together. But after a while, it was discovered it's better actually to do it together and to find the means to do so. And this is where I think ultimately the European Union is pretty good at. They will find possibilities, even within the current legal possibilities, to work more together. But it takes time because people need to get used to it. They need to get to trust each other. They need to know what information can you exchange and what not. Who do you call? Who's on the phone at the other side? Did you actually meet them? So meetings, as a matter of fact, like at conferences, are also very important. But you go on. So it takes perhaps many years, but you get a better protection, cybersecurity, also in public administrations across Europe. And you build up the expertise. So I think that's definitely a strength. Europe can mobilize the legal frameworks, it can mobilize the money, and it can also ultimately mobilize the collaboration that you need for it. The weakness is perhaps it takes time. So cybersecurity is again a good example. You know, cyber criminals, malicious states are acting fast. And do you have the time actually to counteract? And it's also, the comparison does not completely hold, but I think also in other areas we need to really think about the way as policymakers and as governments and as politicians that you work, whether it couldn't be a bit faster and a bit perhaps sometimes more experimental, so that there is a bit more risk-taking in a responsible way, so that overall there is a more adequate response to the challenges of, for example, cybercrime, the challenges of perhaps dissatisfaction with citizens, because they see, you know, I want to have a better service, and perhaps one day they will see actually that in another country it works better than in their country. So, you know, they deserve, they pay for better service, and they are not having eternal life. So let's hurry up a bit more. I don't think we figured that out, how to do that. If you get together, you see examples of other countries. It is actually encouraging. So if I see how Chile made use of the COVID pandemic to rapidly move ahead in digitizing their services, they used the moment in time. That's some people that knew what they were doing. I think, well, that's a good lesson. That's important. That's a form of leadership. We can learn also something from that.
I will chime in just for a second to do two things. First of all, let's expand the scope of this question to a more like global dimension. What do I mean with that is, I asked you, how is the EU positioned in the face of this like new era of computing, let's say. What about comparatively to other blocks that are forming at the moment in the world addressing digital issues, topics related to technology? And I would also at this point include into the equation another topic. So we spoke about the example of cybersecurity and interoperability as well. We just saw some months ago, very recently, in the EU, the whole process and also the approval of the EU AI Act. So, for example, if we were to touch upon this topic and take on a comparative perspective from an EU point of view, how is the EU doing in that sense?
Yeah, if you look at the area of AI, for example, and you see how the developments are there. So here I give really my personal impression. I think it's really good that the EU puts a law in place that gives the framing. I don't believe at all that this is bad for innovation. I still need to see the evidence of that. I think it can be much better used for innovation if it is not only the law, but it is also coming together with, for example, training of the companies, citizens training, not to forget training of the governments and experimentation by the governments. So how do you now do responsible AI? That's one point. Second point is, undoubtedly, it would have been great, if the large language model companies, the generative AI companies, if more of them would have been in Europe. There are several, but most of them are in the US or in China. They are not in Europe, and they are certainly not having that much capital as they have in the United States. But then let's put it a little bit in perspective. So if you get this generative AI and you can actually really use it, you make really use of it, then you will kind of bootstrap. You will build upon that also your next generation of how you do good public services, how you do innovation in industry, how you do innovation in schools. So let me quote another kind of example. When in 2015, I was then still in the European Commission, we were looking at the state of Europe in supercomputers. And it was deplorable because in the top 20, there wasn't a single European supercomputer. Today, 3 of the top 10 are European supercomputers. So they did put in place a policy to build and put in place, start financing and using supercomputers in Europe. And in the meantime, 3 of the top 10 are European. Now, what is the technology that these supercomputers are using? Well, I bet you that a lot of the chips are coming from Taiwan, United States.
From the outside of the EU anyway.
Outside of the EU. And so what, you would say? Because we are going to use these supercomputers to actually do better design of eco-friendly products. We are going to use these supercomputers to build large language models for all our languages in Europe. For better health analysis, etc. So you somehow have to also be a bit realistic and pragmatic, and also probably modest as Europe. We cannot have everything in our own hands, but we can make good use of hardware, software, and ideas that are coming from somewhere else, and then use this for our benefit and the benefit of others, and use it also to build the next generation. Now, this does bring it into geopolitics in a certain sense. So, I've got a lot of interest in technology and geopolitics. And so you get this kind of thing of, if you need the access, for example, to the chips or to the materials of someone else, and they are not willing to play ball because or you don't trust them the way it's being done, it gets geopoliticized, it gets what is called weaponized. And that is indeed a possibility. And in that sense, we are living in a quite different world, I think, from 20 years ago when we were talking about the open global marketplace.
Yes.
I even remember there were G7 conferences that were called the global marketplace.
We're a bit more optimistic, let's say.
A bit more optimistic. Today we are also taking into account that it's not all rosy.
That not everybody has been that optimistic.
No, not everybody has been. And some people are now also saying we were naive and we are now beyond naivety. So we shouldn't be so naive. And that is the reality that is there. So we cannot have it all. We will have to somehow also spend money not only in the best use, but also in the best protected use. And that will cost money,
But you just made me think of another connection that maybe or better, another topic, especially in terms of policy areas and areas for government intervention, or at least for government spending and support, that probably does tie together as well the two topics of technological advancements and geopolitics, which is what I will include now and in this next question is essentially, in short, is industrial policy also an essential topic that now we should take into consideration in order to bring forward digital transformation? What do I mean with this? Digital transformation, I think that to many people's ears, sometimes sounds like something that it's more about developing digital agendas and strategy plans and policy papers and the reorganization of internal processes and things. But is it becoming also increasingly so a topic of interest and attention for what concerns actual industrial policy and states' commitment, let's say, towards that? And not only states, but also the EU's commitment towards that?
Yeah, I would say 100% yes. So doing sensible digital transformation of government must include industrial policy. The reason is you cannot think of doing digital transformation of your government and buy everything from the rest of the world. First of all, that's going to destroy your future jobs. Secondly, you may have a security issue. So how can you accountably do this? But you may not have any other choice Perhaps that's the only thing you can do today because you cannot get it from somewhere else. But then you have to think about it. Why can't you buy this stuff in your own country or in your own continent?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't you have a greater say about it? And so you can learn from what you buy today, how you would do it better today. So if you have to buy it today, avoid that you get into a lock-in. Make sure that in the future you can buy it, you have greater choice. If you see that your own fledgling growing up industry could also benefit from it, yes, stimulate them, involve them in the public procurement process, even if they would not always win. Make sure that they pick up the skills, the capabilities, they know which are the gaps, and that they can fill that. And I must also say that in this debate, so industrial policy has been for a long time been kind of like a red flag.
A red flag?
Because people said, oh, that's protectionism. You know, if you build national champions. Well, two things about it. I think it's a bit of a red herring to call it a red flag. It's not really true. There has always been industrial policy. So, you know, it's deviating the discussion from what really matters. And by the way, what would there be against having a European champion? I wouldn't know. You know, the connotation is that then you are too limited. You have a too narrow view. You do give unfair advantages. There's not enough competition. But there is also a line of thinking amongst global economists that says, well, sure, you need to be able to let your industry develop, but actually with the perspective that they will be able to compete also in the global marketplace. So they are not serving only you. It's difficult in some areas. So one of the areas that is strongly coming up is defense. Mm-hmm. And you would like that your defense industry can operate internationally, that it is a healthy industry, but it will require difficult choices. Not everybody can do everything in defense. You will have to specialize, for example. Defense is a sensitive area. Let's take chips, you know, semiconductors. It would be much better if we can specialize because then everybody will get more benefits. How far do you drive that? To the extent that you get full interdependency globally? No, because then we get geopolitical problems, you know, that comes into play. Do you want to completely renationalize and only do it nationally? No, you can't, because the value chain is too complex. So you'll have to strike somewhere a wise deal. And I think this is what geopolitics today is also very much about. How do you do kind of geopolitics and geoeconomics in such a way that you are not naive, you are not ultimately in the long run destroying the jobs that or not creating the opportunities for the jobs that you want to have, but at the same time you also make sure that you do innovate enough, because we need to have that innovation for what we talked about before, what citizens want, what is needed for the climate, etc., etc. So I think the task of politicians is not that easy. And I would really hope, if not pray, that we have wise politicians who see this kind of balance that they need to strike, and who are also willing then to take the risk, because we don't have all the answers in this game.
And also because in any case, none of these sounds like an issue that, or better, these issues and challenges sound like topics that will extend and expand way beyond the duration of any term, let's say, in politically speaking, that politicians or like parties will, within the EU, but especially this year in general, would come to compete for, let's say, in elections.
Yeah, and I think you're using a right word there. It extends beyond. So in a sense, it goes beyond the borders of the time period that you have available. And it also goes beyond the borders of a single organization. So I find that another kind of striking comment coming back to the e-governance conference that you mentioned, that people were, I think, clearly aware that if you get involved in digital transformation of government, actually the scope of it is a bit wider than only this part of the public administration, and even sometimes a bit wider than your own government. But certainly it extends, the borders are extending beyond that. Is that problematic? I don't think so. You know, you need to think about it. You need to actually involve then others that get also affected. And I think, perhaps I'm an optimist or naive here, but I think that is actually an incentive for more collaboration with at least with like-minded parties. So coming back to the case of cybersecurity, you see that if you try to solve the problems of cybersecurity at the national level, you are simply too small.
Yeah.
If you try to solve it within one part of the administration, you are far too small. You need to work together with others, private, public, across the government, and also with other countries. And then you may be strong enough to deal with these challenges. Climate, same kind of problem. Climate doesn't care about borders.
Paul, on this line of thinking, one last core question, let's say, and then I will ask you like a very, very small one to wrap up this podcast episode. That is actually, the last one will be connected to something that you mentioned, which is the naivety or the beyond naivety, let's say. But before getting to that, what we were just discussing reminded me of something that we have spoken about in the past, and actually in another podcast episode. And because I remembered that at some point, like a couple of years ago or so, we started discussing again in connection to the semiconductor industry and the topic of chips, the fact that national assets, so assets that countries have at their disposal, let's say, and that need to be protected and valued as well, not just protected, can also be national digital assets, no? So in the face of everything that we've been discussing so far, and in this like new era of computing that we are entering, especially considering the advent of AI, what are, from a European perspective, Europe's digital assets?
Mm-hmm. You've got a good memory, Federico, that you can hark back to these podcasts indeed, because we talked about digital assets. And if I remember well, I may have made at that time the point that you can build digital assets that are actually good for your sovereignty, but also good if you collaborate with others. You will not lose sovereignty. You can actually have a triple win in digital assets.
You did make that connection, yes?
I think I made that at the time. And the argument there was, if you look at some of the digital assets that you have, let's say in a continent like Europe, but it could also be with others, then take .eu is a very simple one, the domain name asset. Well, that's clearly good for everybody. Doesn't take any sovereignty away in Estonia or Poland or Germany or what have you. It's good because you have a European asset. It's a real European thing, you might say, because you can have a domain name .eu. And it's good externally because it's recognizable in the world. Of course, you have to promote it, you have to make it visible, but it's an external asset. So digital assets, or no, let's say actually assets of the right kind, are perhaps the assets where you do have a say over. So whether this is locally or nationally, you have some autonomy over these assets. But you can also use them together with others, and actually they also improve your legitimacy in the world. What is that? Well, there are a number of things that you might say are assets in Europe, which is, for example, the way healthcare is organized in a number of countries, the data that are collected with that are very valuable, the diversity that you then have. So differences in data are actually good. That's enriching the value of data.
I would say also like a certain approach to drafting regulation and valuing regulation in a certain way.
Yeah, and for me, overall, one of the real assets is also that you can criticize this. So you have a democratic debate about it. And you can be critical about it. Okay, if you then don't do anything, if you sit on your hands, you've got a problem. But if you use the debate to advance, so you do deliver digital services. Are they good? Yes, they are good today, but they are not good enough for tomorrow. So you be critical about that as citizens, as companies towards your government, and put the bar higher. That's also an asset as a culture. Other things that people, by the way, often mention is the European programs, and perhaps you yourself have been a beneficiary of that, allow young people to travel around a lot, to study for a while in another country. So you get this kind of idea that, actually, well, okay, you have been somewhere else, you know other people, you value that, you don't feel you are only limited to your community, even if you love your community and you would perhaps ever in your life want to live in that trusted community, you are still more open to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. So that's also an asset. Can you valorize that asset? Because everything you talk about also, we will always talk about economics. Perhaps, yeah, perhaps. So can you combine local knowledge with this kind of more international, global perspective? Possibly, yes. So you are starting to hear interesting examples where people are using AI to unlock local knowledge and to connect that to wider frameworks of how you, for example, efficiently organize things or how you get access to the best, for example, international healthcare, but also use the local insights of how people are living healthy. So I think this is all very fascinating because it's enriching for Europeans, at least it would be enriching what they can get locally as services, but also create stronger continent-wide connections. So let's take this word of assets a bit not too narrow. You know, it doesn't need to be the physical things. It doesn't need to be something that you very concretely right now can point to, but something that we might start to use as part of our common culture.
Or maybe to revalue, because the example that you made about exchange, I mean, that's how I first got to Estonia, for example, from the deep south of Italy. And
isn't that great? You know,
absolutely.
You still say, well, I really
never regret that
time.
choice. So, Paul, let's wrap it up with telegraphically one question, because you mentioned the topic of naivety, and I introduced instead the framework, let's say, for this conversation about the eras and eventually maybe like a new era of computing, referencing exactly what we heard as well at the last e-governance conference. One thing that I would ask you is, so every time that there is the feeling that a new era in technology somehow is starting or is coming, I always get the feeling that yes, there are some people and like some speakers, let's say, or like some representatives in society that obviously warn against the risks and are like, oh my God, yeah, it's gonna come and take the jobs and everything, etc. But then at the same time, I see that those that are pushing this technology forward, both monetarily and like financially speaking, in terms of like having the funding to do that, and also having the skills to push this technology forward, there's always great optimism, no? So what do you think that it's the sentiment at the moment instead? You can decide if you want to focus only like on the European perspective or more generally, let's say, on the global scale, drawing some differences, let's say, between blocks, very in a synthetic way, let's say. And the question is exactly, are we naively entering a new era as well this time? And how so and where so?
Yeah. I think not naively, but I think the risk is that we are sucked into a new era without us actually being a bit critical. So if I buy a new car, I want to, and the salesperson will tell me how great this car is. I will also ask, what is the car perhaps not so good at? What is it? Fuel consumption. This car is 2 centimeters wider than the previous car, so you've got more difficulty to maneuver. You really need to understand what is there on the display. So there are also downsides to it, but it's actually very comfortable. It's more silent. It is etc. etc. Also great benefits, and I may buy the car. So I want to have the actual information, not the marketing story, not the doom story. I want to know of this new era, if it's coming. I want to know what do we today think about the positives and the negatives. And trust me, and trust all older people, they can very well judge, if you tell the story honestly, what they will choose. And they will not be anti-technology, and they will not be doomsayers, and they will also not be naive consumers. They will be, I guess, informed adopters. And actually you ask them to think along, how would I use this? So my hope is that we can have just a bit of a cool debate about these kind of things. You know, tell what is there really, tell what we do not know. And so the uncertainty, telling about the uncertainties is also quite important. That helps, I think, everybody to make a choice. So I don't believe at all the stories that Europe would not be good in technology, but perhaps Europe is thinking a bit more about, you know, the positives and the negatives. Fine. In that sense, I'm relatively hopeful that we can make a good move into this new era. Always people, sociologists and historians will tell you, always people have said, oh, now we are really living in different times. It has never been like this and the future, etc. Well, perhaps it's like that now. I must say I tend to agree that there are pretty big changes, as a matter of fact, underway. So I think it is indeed challenging to tell about the positives and the negatives. So, okay, let's take a bit of time for that.
Paul Timmers, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you, Federico.
And thanks a lot also to everybody in our audience for listening to another episode of the Digital Government Podcast. That's it also from your host for today. And tune in to the next one and have a good one.
This podcast is brought to you by the eGovernance Academy. Tune in next time.